This is the 2030 Vision podcast. My name is Stephen Beckman. I'm the Chief Executive Nobody of the Mesh News Project. And this podcast is a companion piece of media to go along with the 2030 Vision movie documentary. You can watch the 2030 Vision documentary at 2030vision.movie. And basically, we go over the stories that were suppressed or underreported during the year 2020 and 2021. And we put it in a great package for you to understand the three main stories that were kind of underreported, misreported, or neglected altogether. Because as the country moves forward, there is a plan. There is a plan for our country. And the best way you can put that is, a person themselves has a, if you've ever dated as an adult, you've probably heard the question, what's your 5-10 year plan? What's your 5-10 year, 20-year plan, whatever, what have you. And countries have the same thing. A lot of people tend to think, countries live in the moment, what have you, but, people who are in elite management positions in our nation, in financial institutions and industry, etc., we all know about the Bilderberg groups. We all know about Davos and things like that, where the World Economic Forum meets. We know about the G7. And these countries, man, they plot out decades in advance how they want to take us. And with society, you can't necessarily move us too fast to a position, but people are definitely malleable. Crowds, consensus, manufacturing consent definitely can happen at a decent speed. And if you have aspirations for your country or an allied group of countries, or an allied group of industries, you can project out forward. And that's why these elite groups of people meet, is they have projections for where they want to go. And, they meet once a year after they make these projections, and then they course correct. Okay, this is what we were projecting to happen. We had this plan, right? 30 years from now, this is where we want to take everything. And then they meet each year to course correct those things, to see how things are going, what the response rate is, what the market is looking like, etc. And since they have, human mass behavior has been figured out. I believe the modern model was pretty much perfected by the 90s for mass behavior consensus and how to control masses, etc. In fact, that is what Noam Chomsky is so well known for. If you've heard that name before, Noam Chomsky, he wrote the book Manufacturing Consent. Noam Chomsky is a internationally recognized linguist and professor and just brilliant mind of our time. And while he is now, I believe, retired, he still is always on people's podcasts. I think he generally wants to just exchange information with the youth and educate people, because, he understands his work isn't done, especially since the media landscape changed since he wrote that. Where his ideas are the same, the logistics of how they're implied maybe have changed slightly. And, we've pretty much figured out the financial system with the advent of modern money mechanics back in the 70s. So the two main drivers of the globe, mass behavior and the world and the economy, has already been figured out. It's almost like we have a user manual. So if this thing is wrong, then we do this. If this thing is wrong, then we do this. If we need to move people to this direction, we do this. If we need them to, accept a certain kind of policy or what have you, we got to make them feel this fear, or we got to put them in this position so they only have one direction to go, what have you. that's what this series is all about. The 2030 Vision documentary series. We had a previous movie called 2020 Vision where we summed up the entire history of the past 20 years from 2000 up until now, and show how a lot of top minds at the time, I want to say in the late 90s, came up with a plan called the Project for a New American Century, and where they laid out all the things they wanted to do, and then literally 20 years later, all those things came to fruition. So, people who are at heads of state, etc., captains of industry, they have long-term plans, and they get implemented, and they get seen. And that's not conspiratorial to even reference, considering humans have 5-10-year plans, etc. But countries are definitely more ambitious. So this podcast series is going to dive a little deeper into each of the 3 sections of our current film in the 2030 Vision series, which is 2030 Vision Year 1, which has to deal with pretty much everything that happened since 2021 and leading up to the year 2030. And today's podcast is going to be about the second act in the podcast. I'm sorry, the third act in the podcast, where we go into the economy and how the economy is going to change by most predictions of what's going on. So we're going to go ahead and show the movie, and then after that, we're going to show the movie. I'm sorry, we're going to show this portion of the movie, and then afterwards, we're going to talk about this portion in detail. There is an audio version of this podcast, but we do have a video version of this podcast on YouTube. So if you're listening in your car or on your earbuds, and maybe you haven't seen the 2030 Vision movie, or you want to see the video that we're talking about specifically, please go to 2030vision.movie, and you can watch the film there. Or within the podcast, we do kind of have a window where we show this portion of the movie. It's not in full frame, and it kind of goes with the design we have with the video podcast. So if you do want to see that portion unobstructed with some of the other graphics that are kind of decorated around it, definitely just go to the 2030 Vision movie. Go to www.2030vision.movie to watch this portion of it. But we will be featuring it and the audio. So let's go ahead and listen to that right now.
And all around the world, people voluntarily shut down major economies in significant part at the same time, simultaneously. No one's ever done that before.
Can the United States spend trillions on COVID relief and trillions more on infrastructure and social programs without setting a match to inflation?
We're not responsible for fiscal policy, and we're reluctant to offer advice to Congress. But we've been through times with very large fiscal deficits recently, for example, right after the global financial crisis, and inflation didn't really react to that. If you go back to the 1960s and 70s, then fiscal policy was a big driver of inflation, and deficits were possibly. There are a lot of theories on that, but you don't really see that now. Ultimately, can we afford to spend the money? I would say it this way. The U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path, meaning the debt is growing faster than the economy, and that's kind of unsustainable in the long run.
President Trump is tackling the coronavirus response from Camp David. This weekend, he left the White House Friday after unveiling more details about the administration's coronavirus vaccine strategy, pledging millions of doses by the end of the year. Meantime, last night, the House approved another stimulus package totaling $3 trillion. We start with that breaking news, the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill passing the Senate.
It is the largest economic stimulus package in recent memory, $2.2 trillion.
Tonight, President Biden applauding his first legislative win, the passage of the country's sixth and largest COVID relief bill.
Hill, where the Senate just passed the $1 trillion infrastructure bill this morning.
Secretary Janet Yellen alerted lawmakers that the nation will hit the debt limit on August the 1st, and she urged Congress to take action soon. Now, already, Treasury is planning to stop the sale of certain state and local government securities on July 30th, just before that debt limit deadline. The department will then have to resort to additional extraordinary measures on August the 2nd. And Yellen did not provide an estimate of how long these tools might last. The Congressional Budget Office had projected October or even November. But Yellen said the pandemic has made this timing particularly uncertain, and those extraordinary measures could run out shortly after Congress returns from its summer recess.
There's a persistent question that keeps coming up, and few really want to take this on squarely or tackle it. And it is this: how much debt, how much money printing can our economy handle before it kind of blows up on itself?
I am so afraid of democracy getting the idea that you can just print money to solve all problems. And eventually, I know that will fail.
We're seeing very substantial inflation. It's very interesting. I mean, we're raising prices. People are raising prices to us. And it's being accepted.
I do think wage inflation is going to be the 800-pound gorilla that really, as we enter 2022, that will be what the headlines are about.
My rent was $900. It is now $1,500.
That ain't right.
Faye Porter is a tenant organizer in Chicago and a paralegal who lost her job during the pandemic. She's been fighting rent increases for a decade now, including a $70 hike last June.
This is how I have to heat my apartment in the wintertime.
While she's watched her living conditions deteriorate.
Have you noticed fewer chips in that snack bag lately? Does that family-sized box of cereal not last as long as it used to? You're not imagining things. Consumer companies that make food and beverages and household staples like paper towels have been shrinking package sizes, weights, and quantities. Why? Thanks to COVID disruptions mainly, commodity prices have spiked this year, from sugar or soybeans to corn. So have other costs like aluminum for packaging or transportation for shipping. Instead of taking the hit, manufacturers are passing those higher costs onto the consumer, and they do it without you noticing because the actual sticker price of the item doesn't change. It's not a new strategy, but the trend is accelerating at the moment, with companies including Kimberly-Clark, ConAgra, and PepsiCo all talking about having to raise prices. PepsiCo's CEO on a recent earnings call justifying the increases by saying, obviously, same as everybody else, we're seeing inflation in our business across many of our raw ingredients and some of our inputs in labor and freight and everything else. Consumer advocates say they've seen product downsizing ramping up in the past few months.
Oh, it's absolutely a sneaky process because they know that most consumers are not going to catch the fact the product net weight has changed. Consumers just don't pay attention to that. They get a general sense of the size carton or box or package that they buy and they grab it. In the case of General Mills, for example, Apple Cinnamon Cheerios went from 20.1 ounces to 19 ounces. It's still called family size. The family must have gotten smaller, but you lost a full bowl of cereal recently.
In other words, our costs are rising even though prices aren't changing.
Customers expressing outrage this morning after the bank informed them it is ending all existing personal lines of credit in the coming weeks and will no longer offer the product.
James Gorman discussing the future of inflation, and while he believes rate hikes are not as transitory as people think, other investors are still trying to read the clues. Over at JP Morgan, their CEO Jamie Dimon says there's a very good chance it's here to stay and that they'll be hoarding cash just in
The Federal Reserve has discontinued publishing their M1 and M2 money stock series. Here to discuss the implications and what this means and why they've done this is an expert.
M2 is a calculation of the money supply. And so it's a measure of the money supply that includes cash, checking, deposits, and easily convertible near money. It's a broader measure of the money supply. So money that's in your checking account, that's money that you're probably going to spend on your monthly bills. The broader money supply, the cash, the checking, deposits, and stuff, that's a broader money supply. It's money that wouldn't be spent so easily. It's kind of like your savings. M2 is closely watched as an indicator of money supply and future inflation and as a target of central bank monetary policy. So now that you understand what it is and why it's important, let's take a look at this chart. And we can see here, this is the M2 money stock. This is back to 1985, 1990, the year 2000. And so you can see it just kind of stayed here. It kind of started coming up here as the year 2000. This is the 2008 financial crash right here. It came down, of course. Everybody lost their money. They had to dip into their savings. It started coming back up. I mean, look at this. And then look at this. Does that look normal? When you zoom out, does that look normal? So that's the M2 money supply.
Remember, most of what people thought was money was actually credit. So when credit disappears, people don't have enough money. People are desperate for money, and you remember who can print money? The central bank can. Having already lowered its interest rates to nearly zero, it's forced to print money. Unlike cutting spending, debt reduction, and wealth redistribution, printing money is inflationary and stimulative. Inevitably, the central bank prints new money out of thin air and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds. It happened in the United States during the Great Depression, and again in 2008 when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. Basically, income needs to grow faster than debt grows. For example, let's assume that a country going through a deleveraging has a debt-to-income ratio of 100%. That means that the amount of debt it has is the same as the amount of income the entire country makes in a year. Now think about the interest rate on that debt. Let's say it's 2%. If debt is growing at 2% because of that interest rate, and income is only growing at around 1%, you will never reduce the debt burden. You need to print enough money to get the rate of income growth above the rate of interest. However, printing money could easily be abused because it's so easy to do and people prefer it to the alternatives. The key is to avoid printing too much money and causing unacceptably high inflation the way Germany did during its deleveraging in the 1920s.
Every government wants the ability to create new money. Okay, it's an alternative to raising taxes. Taxes, as we said, when they're raised, tend to evoke a lot of resistance among the public. It's much less painless to increase the money supply. The effects, the negative effects, don't occur until 6 months, a year, 2 years later, at which time the increasing prices can be blamed on other factors, the weather, speculators, and so on.
But the Fed's real power lies in its monopoly to create money. Although the U.S. was still on the gold standard in 1913, it was quickly eroded as the Fed continued to expand the money supply. The first step was backing Federal Reserve notes by only 40% in gold, allowing the money supply to be increased 2.5 times. The Federal Reserve System adds another inflationary layer to an already unstable banking system. For example, if the central bank has $100 worth of gold reserves in its vaults and a 10% reserve requirement, it can print up $1,000 of new notes and deposits, which become the reserves of the commercial banks. The commercial banks take this $1,000, and if they're required to hold 10% again in reserve, they can multiply the $1,000 into $10,000 through fractional reserve loans. So an inverted pyramid is created with $100 worth of gold or real money at the bottom and $10,000 of inflated paper money at the top. By making enormous amounts of credit easily available, the Fed can also drive down interest rates, sending out the wrong signal to investors. It sets in motion an unsustainable investment boom that carries with it the seeds of its own destruction. It's this business cycle that is ultimately responsible for economic disasters such as the Great Depression. Soon after the Federal Reserve was established, the U.S. entered World War I. Once again, the government temporarily abandoned the gold standard to print more money to finance the war effort. The U.S. government borrowed heavily, and the national debt ballooned from $1 billion to $27 billion. A sharp spike of inflation followed. This set off a cycle of rapid expansion and contraction in the economy. To dampen the overheated economy, the Fed halted its inflation, causing interest rates to nearly double over the next 18 months. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president and quickly implemented a New Deal policy of spending us to prosperity. Even though we needed lower taxes and lower spending, his administration would seek unprecedented amounts of money to finance its big government programs. In his inaugural speech on March 4, 1933, Roosevelt vowed to put an end to poverty and the unemployment lines and get people back to work. It didn't work. The Depression got worse, thanks to increased central planning. FDR only succeeded in making the monetary system even less sound. Just after taking office, the president declared a 4-day nationwide bank holiday, absolving the bankrupt fractional reserve banks of any need to repay their depositors. But before the banks reopened, the Roosevelt administration had to come up with a scheme that would lead people to believe that new deposits would be safe. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to lull the public into a sense of security. In reality, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation holds just 0.5% of all the deposits it insures. But what people are counting on is that the Fed, as the lender of last resort, would step in and print whatever money would be necessary to prevent a massive bank run. President Roosevelt was on hand for the dedication of a new $3.5 million building to house the Fed.
I dedicate this building today to progress toward the ideal of an America in which every worker will be able to provide his family at all times with an ever-rising standard of American comfort.
1933 also marked the beginning of the end for the gold standard. There was no end to Roosevelt's appetite for spending on such New Deal programs as the gigantic $13 billion Tennessee Valley Authority, which flooded vast areas of productive farmland to provide government-subsidized electricity. The Works Progress Administration, which spent $11 billion on make-work jobs and pork barrel public works. But the U.S. currency was tied to gold, which limited the amount of money the Fed could print to pay for these costly projects. So the government scrapped the gold standard for American citizens in 1933, and then Roosevelt confiscated the people's gold.
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin.
It's Bitcoin.
And Bitcoin.
Gold and Bitcoin.
With that digital currency, Bitcoin, which has again reached a new record.
For the first time, a Bitcoin has been valued at more than $10,000.
The cryptocurrency breaking through 20,000 yesterday.
First, Bitcoin. That falls into that category because that's what that is. 39,000.
Check this out. Bitcoin. It broke through the $50,000 level just a short time ago.
So here's what's going on, is that Bitcoin itself is an existential threat to the central bankers. That's what this was designed. It was designed as an alternative financial system. With Bitcoin, you don't necessarily need a central banker. If you want one, go have a ball. But in the Bitcoin cryptocurrency ecosystem, you don't need those central bankers. Not only that, Bitcoin is an alternative here. So it's the new guard versus the old guard out there, right? So this is kind of like when the newspapers went online. All the newspaper editors said, that's never going to work. New guard, old guard. And then finally, the difference here is what the whole thing about Bitcoin is peer-to-peer. It removes the middleman. And the middleman in this particular case is the BIS and the central bank. So Bitcoin is like the Napster of money. And that's what they don't like about it.
But the Chinese Communist Party is not a fan of Bitcoin. Bitcoin are created and moved around not by a central bank or financial institution, but by a broad and disparate network of computers on what's called a blockchain. Bitcoin operates entirely outside of China's central bank or Communist Party control. It gives Chinese people a way to use money completely free from oversight by the government. So if you're, say, a Chinese dissident, the Communist Party can make the bank freeze your savings account, but they can't freeze your Bitcoin assets.
India is moving to wage full-scale war against Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. The government has made it known it will soon make the possession of virtual currencies like Bitcoin a criminal offense.
Banks always used to exist. And then with the Bank of England, they decided that it was in their interest to have a monopoly on banking at a country. And so what we did is every country treasures its monopoly on controlling the supply and demand. They don't want other monies to be operating or competing because things can get out of control. So I think that it would be very likely that you will have it under a certain set of circumstances outlawed the way gold was outlawed.
Governments are the ones that have the fear. Well, they should have some fear. They have taken control and power away from their citizens for hundreds of years. It's time that we, as citizens, took that power back.
I think a digital U.S. coin currency, fiat currency, like a US blockchain,
Fed blockchain, basically.
like a Fed coin will compete with the current cash system. If that happens, ACH, FedWire, they don't exist because you don't need them, right? Just like long distance phone calls don't exist, right? It all goes over the internet now as opposed to different legacy rails.
In 1694, the Bank of England became the first public bank to regularly issue banknotes as an alternative to coins as a means of payment. 3 centuries later, it's primarily tasked with maintaining price stability, much like any other central bank across the world. But these cautious institutions are now buzzing with talk of a revolutionary concept, a form of money you cannot see: central bank digital currency.
Hey, McFly! What do you think you're doing? Biff. Hey, I'm talking to you, McFly, you Irish bug.
Oh, hey, Biff. Hey, guys. How are you doing?
Yeah, you got my homework finished, McFly?
Well, actually, I figured since it wasn't due till Monday.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Hey, think, McFly, think. I gotta have time to recopy it. You realize what would happen if I hand in my homework in your handwriting? I'd get kicked out of school. You wouldn't want that to happen, would you? Would you?
Well, no, of course not, Biff. I wouldn't want that to happen.
You're trying to measure one thing against another using a common denominator. And so let's say, for example, if you would if pictures were GDP, if all GDP were pictures, and then you would say, what's the value of pictures? And you would say it plunged to 0. But yet there are more pictures. You could take them on your phone and you could take them all around. And there's not a good translation mechanism for saying, okay, actually, we got all of this other stuff around. And it's so because you have not a common denominator when you try to put that in value, if you change value. But it also creates tremendous social consequences in terms of things like incomes and wealth disparities and so on, that we haven't begun to approach, like how does one deal with that? So there are going to be revolutions, revolutionary changes ahead in terms of all of those issues. In other words, okay, how do you deal with the wealth? What does it mean? Do you have to be productive? What do you do with those people? Is it cost effective? And then you think about even things like how it's going to have an impact on longevity. I mean, like if you take average lifespan and so on, you see an upward curve, and then you see the reasons for that upward curve in many, many ways, wearables and all sorts of things. So the world is going to change in an incredibly fast pace. And then related to that, that technological change, whoever wins the technology race wins it all economically and militarily. So yes, that's what the next 5 years looks like, I think.
A digital dollar is something that has function far beyond just the transfer of money. And so it's inevitable that national currencies or sovereign currencies will come into an effect. I do think that we'll see private currencies or things like cryptocurrency have their place within the entire ecosystem.
But I'm focusing on the Fed coin, on the Fed dollar, if you will.
I believe the plan is to blow up the headquarters of these credit card companies and the TRW building.
Why these buildings? Why credit card companies?
If you erase the debt record, then we all go back to zero. You met me at a very strange time in my life.
With your feet on the air, try this trick and spin it. Yeah. Get hell of the lights, but there's nothing in it, and you'll ask yourself.
Great. So, portion where, we go into great detail about what's going on with our financial system, what are the plans for the future, what do the experts say. These are all backed by mainstream news sources. We don't pull anything out of the ether. We don't use obscure websites, what have you. We generally believe that mainstream media and corporate news tells on itself. But there's so much news out there. I mean, with, your news feed and websites and the radio and podcasts. And there's only so much shit that you can listen to and watch and read and pay attention to in a day, and a lot of it goes by the wayside. And I feel like personally that corporate media, mass media knows this, and so they tend to what mass media tends to do is it's kind of like an insurance policy where they like to report on things but only do it once. They don't keep repeating, they don't keep it in the news cycle, so they make sure everyone listens to it or sees it, so they're aware of it. So when shit does hit the fan, they have a fallback where they can be like, hey, we told you about this. Hey, back here. But no, you guys didn't listen to us. And, I mean, the best example for that is the Epstein case, where, after the Miami Herald was the first to really break the story, besides some podcasters, believe it or not. One in particular that got completely deplatformed was screaming about this dude on his show. Soon after, but yeah, believe it or not, Alex Jones, one of the things he did get right was the Epstein case. He was one of the people that was screaming about it on his show. So, while he may go, get really passionate about some of the topics that he talks about, and he might miss, and because he misses, it will harm his credibility, which ended up pissing off a lot of people, obviously, or else he wouldn't have been deplatformed. He was right about that. And Miami Herald was also one of the people that reported on the Epstein case years before it became mainstream news. And what the mainstream news does is they reported on that just a little bit, so they wouldn't be completely guilty of protecting, wealthy people. So they report on it just barely, or they air the story once on like Saturday at 2 p.m. or Saturday at 2 a.m. when no one's watching or what have you. So they can at least say that they reported on it. So, and it's like an insurance policy, so they can not seem like they completely abandon their viewers' best interest and can maintain their credibility. And that's essentially how they tell on themselves. Or they'll report something, but they only report it once. And not everyone's watching the same program all at once anymore. It's just too much. And so they can get away with reporting the actual truth by just saying it once. And, this undertaking to make these documentaries is immense. I'm watching pretty much the news for about a month straight. I'm just, and I'm looking for, I'm looking for all the gems, and then I gotta look for, congruency, and if it's a pattern, does it match something currently? Is there any research that big that you can base this off of, etc. And there's so much work goes into this documentary. Our last documentary took about 3 months of just research alone, and then about a month of actual, research alone, and then about a month of just putting the damn thing together. Believe it or not, day and night, putting in like 10-hour days, editing this documentary, making it work, making it relevant, trying to make it entertaining, because this is essentially we're doing it's the news, but people often are blindsided because they don't realize things that are coming. So we do some basic analysis for what's coming, what the future holds, and then we chop it up together. Now, I would like to say I am not at all the brainchild of this. I definitely had some muses. I had some brilliant minds kind of give me some guidance on certain ways of thought, etc. And by no means am I a product of myself when coming up with this series, because there are a lot of dead ends, and I'm a one-man show, and I'm literally making everything in this project, literally every video you see, the website, all the graphics, etc. I'm making it on a cell phone, not a computer, not a laptop, not a tablet, on a cell phone. Everything that this project develops, makes, puts out, every product is made on the cell phone. I have it in my pocket. So there's also that struggle, because these devices aren't made to put out content like that. It seems like it should be easy like that, but then there's the quality of content. Do you understand? There's the capabilities of devices. They're not exactly made like computers, laptops, more powerful things. It's a phone, and I'm using, $3, $5 apps here, web editor here, screen grab that's edited here. Like, no Photoshop is. I mean, I have a background in marketing for about a decade. I have my bachelor's degree in advertising. I've been using, Adobe Cloud and etc. for years. So when I switched over to limit myself to using phones only, the workflow changes. I have to constantly try to figure out how I'm going to make something work. I have another phone which I use. It helps with rendering. On top of, so there's just huge hurdles out of the way, and I know I'm yammering on and on, but you need to really understand the amount of work and dedication and struggles that I'm put through to create this final product and then give it to you guys, so you can consume and you can at least digest this information, so then you can be aware and watch things as they happen. But I would like to reiterate that I am nobody without my muses and people who have guided me through ways to analyze data, disinformation, etc. And a lot of that takes time to learn. And absolutely, I am not a product of myself. I am not a kid genius. A lot of bright minds helped me along the way to be able to give you this product, and hopefully you guys enjoy it. So let's go ahead and talk about what we just saw. So the movie opens up talking about our unsustainable debt problem that the U.S. currently has. We got Jerome Powell, which is the sitting Fed chair, and basically he's just saying that we spend more per year than we make. We are upside down. Definitely upside down. Even Janet Yellen, who is now running shit over there, had to let us know that we're about to hit the debt ceiling last year. I want to say more towards fall, because, you know, we really reached a crescendo when this COVID BS hit, when China sent that virus over here. And, you know, it really fucked us financially. And it's a situation which I don't think most people understand. The fact that we hit the debt ceiling and then we had to raise it again means that we plotted out a budget, and then we gave ourselves a ceiling for that budget, meaning like, this is what we plan to spend, but if it gets out of fucking control and it hits the ceiling, we're gonna have to regroup or whatever. But so that means that they did not plan to spend that much. You understand? And essentially, if you're not understanding what the debt ceiling is, it's like, the best way I can put it, let's say your mom gives you $20 for pizza, but then leaves her credit card behind in case there's any other expenses up to, like, I don't know, $100. But you end up having a party when she's gone, and the party costs $250. But you now have to call mom and raise the limit and bullshit to her as to why it is that you spent over so much money, so she can justify raising the limit on the fucking card. And it's an unsustainable method of moving forward, and it's something that we've just kind of normalized as a country. I mean, I want to say every other year we have some big show in the media about raising the debt ceiling, and a lot of people, I think they're just like, oh no, I guess we got to raise the debt ceiling, and they're just like, whatever that means. Believe it or not, lots of people are just like, oh yeah, that's really bad, and they talk about it, but I don't think a lot of people really understand exactly what's going on here. We shouldn't raise the ceiling. You know, we have a debt, and then we plan for more than that, and then we'll hit that fucking ceiling. And you know, Charlie Munger, that's why why we break to Charlie Munger in that third act, because he's right. Spending doesn't solve all of our country's problems. And, you know, if you don't know who Charlie Munger is, he's the number 2 at Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway, very successful financial group led by Warren Buffett. But Charlie Munger is right. You know, spending isn't going to solve all the country's problems. We need to learn to budget. We need to learn to plan for things that is going to increase overall wealth. We need to stop solving problems as they arise and plan for them. Because it's kind of feeling like whenever we face a problem, well, we'll just print some more money. We'll just print some more money. And it's definitely affecting things. And one of their, I imagine it's like an annual report, you know, it then cuts to him also saying that the prices are rising. And Berkshire Hathaway, you know, they keep their finger on the pulse over there. And the reason why people are raising prices is because manufacturers' costs are rising. And when that happens, they're going to then pass the cost on to someone else, because they're not going to stop making a profit. And that's kind of where it's going. That's usually when we get our first indicators that something is going on. It's like a rising temperature, if you will. You know, inflation, granted, inflation goes up and goes down a little bit, and that should be expected. When it reaches a certain point when everything is starting to change, it's kind of like, it's almost like global warming, where that's our indicator that, okay, we're fucking up here. So believe it or not, wage inflation is going to be a huge issue. And what essentially is wage inflation? Well, essentially wage inflation is, let's say the cost of living increases as it's measured by the nation's consumer price index. Like, you can tell by the fact that things cost more, your gas costs more, cars cost more, obviously, right? And then eventually people realize that incomes fall if wages increase. If wage increase fails to keep pace with inflation. So, we do get a little bit of increase per year to kind of mitigate how inflation is with your pay and etc. to make sure the cost of living isn't hitting us so hard. But if that wage increase, if our incomes go up 1% every year, but inflation is at 5%, or what it's at right now, it's at 7%, believe it or not. Cost of living, we're not going to be able to afford our lifestyle. At least, I guess you want to call it a lifestyle, if paying your bills is a fucking lifestyle, right? So then workers are like, you know what, I need to talk to the union, or we need to talk to whoever handles wages. And then we need to make sure to protect our lifestyle. We need to, strike or whatever, or what have you, to make sure we're not left behind. Our company needs to understand that their wage increase doesn't necessarily match where inflation is going. And wage inflation, I don't think people really understand, it's going to be the smoking gun as things get progressively worse. So cost of living increases, then people start to then workers, working class, middle class people start to realize I can't afford my lifestyle anymore, and this is because prices are increasing. So then those workers bid for improved wages, and then eventually they'll win. Eventually they'll win negotiations or what have you, like you're seeing with the Kellogg strike, etc., happening 2001. I don't know when you're listening to this podcast, but eventually they win those strikes, etc. And what do companies do? Well, they're not going to start taking less money. What they're going to do is pass that on to the consumer. So this leads to higher labor costs. So then the companies will raise their prices to cover the higher wage increase. And then since the wage increases, this contributes to inflation. And because inflation happens, eventually people realize they can't afford the lifestyle anymore. So then they bid together and they go on strike to increase their wages. And then that leads to a higher labor cost. So the company raises their prices, which then contributes to inflation. Do you see how this goes around and round and round and round? And this could get out of control. And when you have an economy spiraling out of control, they're not going to keep going to the bargaining table every month as inflation hits and it starts hitting hard. And so this is something that we're starting to understand. It's the reason why Walmart will now pay an entry-level employee $18.50 to come on board, just to work the stock room. We're already seeing this now. These crazy wages to do, I wouldn't call it low skilled, but a working class job in the new modern economy. And this cycle keeps going on and on and on and on and on forever. And then there's something called the wage price spiral. And a wage price spiral, not just wage inflation, but a wage price spiral, is, as people realize, like, hey, this inflation thing is sticking around. It's not transitory. So that's when you're hearing things like, oh, wages transitory, means it's like, it's just going to be a little high for right now while we get back in the swing of things or what have you. And now we're learning that inflation is not transitory. It is going to be a standard. And then when people hear that, they then supersede their expectations for what inflation is going to be like a year from now, 2 years from now. So when they go to the negotiating table, they ask for even more than they think that they can get, because they're thinking ahead to inflation, because they see no end to it. And then that's how, you get one of those wage price, spirals where it just goes over on and on and on and on. And what I just described there. And, considering where the market is going and how prices are increasing, and it's now the main story, or one of the main stories besides COVID and the fact that we might go toe-to-toe with Russia and China. It feels like the obvious time to start stacking things like Bitcoin or stacking sats. If you can't afford a whole Bitcoin, they call it sats or satoshis, to start stacking sats or buying actual gold. Because it doesn't seem like this is going to go anywhere. And with the way things are projected, like this could get out of control. One thing besides wage increase though, is that rent is increasing. In fact, in 2021 alone, would you believe this, rent has increased 3 times as fast as the actual rate of inflation. Can you believe that? So the cost of living of just having a roof over your head has increased 3 times faster than the actual crazy overinflated stock market that we have. I'm going to go ahead, and there's a article on Market Watch by Brett Ahrens, where he goes into exactly why this is happening, how this is happening, and how we can measure the fact that it's going up 3 times as much. It says, if you want to be reminded why it's such a good idea to own your own home in retirement, listen to Matthew Fine. He's the guy who's taken over Marty Whitman's old mutual fund, Third Avenue Value. And in his latest letter to his investors, he's pointed out something that he has been watching, and a lot of Wall Street hasn't. In a nutshell, the official inflation figures are a bit of a crock. And the reason is that the actual house price inflation is running away, way ahead of the official house price inflation. You can see the he said you can see the numbers on my chart above, and the chart here and above is that the official consumer price index is at 2.5%. The S&P Case-Shiller National Home Price Index shows that housing prices are up 16%, but realtor listings for said houses are up 25%. So something's off here. This is the number on the left is what the U.S. Labor Department, which compiles the official inflation data, says is the increase in housing costs from January 2020 through April of this year. I've used what they've called the shelter number, which excludes all the other home ownership costs like utilities. This is just the cost of owning the home. The number in the middle is what the nationally recognized S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National House Price Index says has happened to house prices over the same period. The number on the right is what Realtor.com, which, like Market Watch, is owned by News Corp, says has happened to the average listing prices over the same period. Inflation is likely to be higher than the Federal Reserve expects and less transitory. A number of arguments to do with low interest rates and material and labor shortages as the world reopens. But one of them is the issue with the official inflation figures and housing. As it relates to inflation as depicted by Consumer Price Index, he writes, the measurement of housing costs appears to be substantially disconnected from reality. The U.S. government has estimated rental rates and primary residence to be growing at 2% or less in recent months. After talking to homeowners, it reckons market rental rates for owner-occupied homes has been growing slightly above 2%. So you need to understand that, yes, your rental costs are going up. No, your landlord's bills are getting higher because he has his rate locked in with his mortgage. But their cost of living is going up. And so they are going to now pass this cost of living on to renters, which is why, things are really getting out of control. And it's something that should be paid attention to a little more of how landlords are adjusting to the financial climate and using their rental properties as a buffer so their lifestyles don't change. So not only is rent going up, but something called shrinkflation is happening. Shrinkflation in economics, shrinkflation is known as the grocery shrink rate, or package downsizing. It's a process of items shrinking in size or quantity, or even sometimes reformulating or reducing quality while their prices remain the same or increase. The word is a promenatu of the words shrink and inflation. Commodity prices, and the reason... So just as the documentary reports, is that we're getting a lower quantity of groceries and, items, etc. But the price is staying the same. They're keeping the packaging the same, and they're slowly reducing the food weight amount on the packaging without us even noticing. And that's a trick that food manufacturers do to make us not realize that prices are increasing, so we don't switch to a more bargain basement brand of something, so we don't feel our quality of life is being affected. And so what they'll do is they'll keep the packaging the same, they'll keep the price the same, but they'll reduce the amount of whatever's going in, or they'll reformulate the bottle. I don't know if you've ever seen those skinny bottles that replace the 20-ounce bottles of like soda pop and like brisk iced tea and stuff like that. But they'll reshape the packaging. They play all sorts of tricks on us to make us not start cutting back or realizing that prices are going up. And the reason one of the main reasons they do that, aside from the fact they don't want you to switch to an alternate lower cost brand to maintain your consumption lifestyle, is because a huge amount of money goes into branding. And so if you start to associate negative emotions with, a higher price for my favorite thing, your favorite thing is no longer associated with your favorite thing. Do you understand? Like, now you have attached to it an unpleasantness of the price increasing. So they go through all this trickery with shrinkflation and redoing the packaging, etc., to make you feel like you're still getting the same product experience. And that's one of another ways when you can start to realize that the American way of living is on the brink of changing. Is just when even the small disposable income consumer products are starting to now have to play magic tricks on us, so we don't realize what's going on. And that's obviously because prices are increasing for them as well. I do, however, would like to point out that as long as I can remember, going far back, it's like, 2001, Arizona tea has always been 99 cents. I'm talking about that big tall can, 99 cents. That's something that I haven't noticed at all change with as inflation rates go up or down. I don't know what it is that they're doing that's going on over there, but if Arizona tea could be making the same product for 20 years and it not affect the price, I'm so curious about what goes on in the Arizona tea factory. I'm not going to stop buying it. I think Arizona tea, it's great on a hot day, but I think that's a little funny to think about. It'd be interesting to see what happens to that company while inflation happens. If they change the price or the cans get smaller or what have you, because this level of inflation, I don't think is going to be like a spike like the 2008 global financial crash. This is going to stick around. But it's interesting how they're trying to play tricks on us so we don't feel like our quality of life is changing. The film goes on talking about J.P. Morgan Chase stockpiling cash. And if you don't know exactly, what that means, is essentially J.P. Morgan is stockpiling cash rather than using it to buy treasuries or other investments, because of the possibility of higher inflation will force the Federal Reserve to boost interest rates. And then Diamond, who's the head of J.P. Morgan right now, was saying that he has a lot of cash and capabilities, but they're going to be very patient, because I think you will have a very good chance. This is in early 2001. He said there's a very good chance inflation will be more than transitory, and he was absolutely right. So to think about the current financial situation that we're in, so you get a real bird's eye view of what the fuck is going on. Currently, the United States, after we blew through all those spending bills supposedly to keep the economy alive, which I don't know how it kept the economy alive. Everyone was forced to stay at home. Everyone had to get everything delivered. Service industry people were just decimated. Just normal business couldn't go about. But after we passed all those $1 trillion spending packages, I think there's like 5 or 6 passed in total, it raised our debt to $30 trillion. $30 trillion. Keep saying that and really have an understanding of how much $30 trillion is. If you were to put the length of just $1 trillion end to end, so if you had $1 trillion if you had $1 trillion $1 bills laid end to end, that would measure 96,906,656 miles long. This would exceed the distance from the Earth to the Sun. And that is just $1 trillion and dollar bills laid end to end. It would exceed the distance between here at Earth and the Sun. And that's 1 trillion. And as spending continues to go this way, and there is no real prediction that it's going to change. It's projected by 2026, our debt to GDP ratio will reach double our economy of 26 trillion per year. So that means that our country makes $26 trillion per year. But the debt that we're paying on, plus interest, is $30 trillion. So we're already in the red. And if you know just basic money mechanics, even a 1-to-1 ratio is a better position to be in. Let's say we made $26 trillion a year, but our national debt was $26 trillion. That would be a better position to be in. But unfortunately, we're in the red. And as history will tell us, what usually happens around this time to fix this is people start printing money. And they print a lot of it. Because it's easier to print more money to try to spend your way out of debt or spend your way into stimulating the economy to get yourself out of the debt trap than it is to, cut spending, reduce debt, and redistribute the wealth so working class people have more money and more options to do things. That's usually the formula, but it sucks because everyone has to contribute, and the country as itself has to know, hey, the country is in debt. The way we're running shit has to change. All the social programs we're paying for, etc., has to change. Although I don't think the U.S.'s social programs is what's putting us in such enormous debt. We just got out of a 20-year-long illegal war, which Dick Cheney and George Bush put us in over 20 years ago. It's a little hilarious that even though Liz Cheney's father essentially helped put us in this horrible financial position that we're in right now, so his companies could essentially just make a bunch of money. So basically, Liz Cheney is funded by a 20-year illegal $8 trillion war that we even still have her in office. We figured that, and considering that her father trained her in the ways of everything he knows, essentially having her in office is like having a female Dick Cheney in office. But that's for another episode. So we're spending out of control. And then what happened? What was the response to our spending? Was to hide how bad inflation really was. So we stopped publishing our M1 and M2 money supply. And the reason why is this is so you don't know how much money is being printed to hide reported inflation rates from the public and our enemies. It's the only reason why you'd want to hide how much money was in circulation, but they just stopped reporting on it altogether. And if you see the rate that money is being printed, and you use the 2008 financial crisis as a measure for how bad, if we crash, how hard it will be. Just look at that graph, that M2 money supply graph in the documentary. Holy fuck. Holy fuck. If we crash, it will be so hard. I don't even think people can wrap their head around exactly what's going on. I don't really think so. That graph is amazing in that movie. It is amazing. So basically, our income has to grow faster than our debt to dig our way out of this impending doom. I don't see that's going to happen. We don't have any projections that our GDP will grow by several trillions of dollars in the next 4 years. Although our debt to GDP ratio is expected to double in the next 4 years, meaning by 2026, we're not going to owe $30 trillion, we're going to owe $52 trillion in debt with no real change or projected change to our $26 trillion a year economy. So our income has to grow faster than our debt to dig our ways out of this. It just has to. And they're not going to do it the way that we should do it, by cutting spending, which means we have to cut back on our military, which the U.S. is just not going to do. We have a nearly $1 trillion a year military. Nearly $1 trillion. That's our real money sink right there. But we're not gonna change it. Like I said, cutting spending, debt reduction, wealth redistribution is the uncool ways to deal with this. But lots of politicians are just like, oh, we'll just print more money to make the situation get worse, to make the situation better. We'll just spend our way into a more stable economy. And even Jerome Powell, in the beginning of this segment of the documentary, it's funny how he phrases, we don't tend to consult, monetary policy. I think that's his words. But basically saying, we're not going to tell the U.S. what they should do, but we will lend them money. Like, that's crazy. That is crazy. That is so crazy. That is so crazy. Germany experienced the same situation back in the 1920s, and their solution was to just keep printing money. And hyperinflation went out of control. Their country hit a major depression. the best modern analog for this is Venezuela. Venezuela's inflation is so bad. There's actually videos you can go on and see online where the streets are littered with its own currency, like you would see trash on Skid Row. Just littered all over the place. All over the place. Littered. And, you know, this situation only gets out of control because banks literally create money out of thin air. $100 in the bank, or $100 in gold, what have you, allows a bank to lend up to $10,000 because of how leveraging works. So if you put $100 in the bank, or let's say you have $100 in gold, I guess, in gold bonds with your bank, this would allow your bank to lend out $10,000 to somebody who needs a small business loan or what have you, and the bank gets a profit based off of these lending practices. This is kind of the modern way money is treated now. And believe it or not, this is essentially why the first financial crash happened, is because our banking and fiscal policies were so bananas. And, you know, FDR, when he, FDR, the president FDR, when he took office around 1933, you know, he implemented essentially pretty much the day he took office. Because he took office when all the banks crashed. Nobody had any trust in the financial industry in the United States. As soon as FDR took office, he implemented I'm bringing this up because it has to relate to why our banking system is so upside down. That inverted pyramid, how $100 can be $10,000, is because this got out of control, and it's the reason why, you know, one of the contributing reasons why our financial system crashed way back in the 1920s and 30s. So right after he took office, supposedly he had some great plan to fix everything. That's essentially why he got elected, because of the system. So FDR took office and implemented a 4-day banking holiday, essentially, right as he got in. And during this 4-day banking holiday, he wiped the slate clean for all banks and told them they didn't have to pay back their lenders, etc. And then he created the FDIC. And you may have seen FDIC, you may have heard FDIC insured and like commercials or what have you. Basically, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, basically, it just ensures that if something happens to your money, like a bank robbery or what have you, somebody comes and takes your money out of the bank, steals the money, lots of fraud, what have you, the FDIC would insure that money up to a certain amount. Usually it's like $100,000 or something like that. And that created a false sense of security for people to go back to the banks, because everyone got a bad taste in their mouth from the banks because of this upside down banking system that we had and been implemented forever. And you know, the FDIC created trust back in the banks because now there was insurance backing everyone's money. What people didn't realize at the time was that the FDIC only has enough money on hand to cover 0.5% of the funds that it says that are insured. So the FDIC is a bit like wearing a cloth mask instead of like an N95 respirator. It's fancy theater. It's to make you feel like your money is safe. But believe it or not, that worked way back then, even though we have this upside down system. And because of this upside down system is what, you know, is the reason why all those financial crashes happened. So after he did that, created the FDIC, he also ended the gold standard. The gold standard kept a ceiling on how much money we could print, so we didn't get into a situation where inflation would be out of control. So soon after he wiped the slate clean for all the banks that fucked us, created the FDIC for false sense of security, he also ended the gold standard. And supposedly it's protected our money from, this protected our economy from, inflation or what have you. Because since our monies were no longer attached to how much gold we had in our reserves, we could then print as much money as as we wanted and just say the value is based off of this. Now, if you're curious about what the gold standard is, I know a lot of people talk about it. A lot of people have, like to talk about how corrupt the banks are, or what have you. Great example is Gaddafi. You guys remember Gaddafi? Gaddafi wanted to start his own gold standard. He was going to back his currency because, believe it or not, Gaddafi was extremely wealthy. One of the most wealthy countries in Africa, Gaddafi's country. He was actually in the process before he got his country overthrown and he got assassinated or executed, murdered. I don't know. Gaddafi was in the process of going against the international banking cartels and implemented a gold and petrodollar standard. He was going to call it the dinar. And it was going to be backed by gold, and it was going to be worth more than the world reserve currency. It was going to be backed by an actual unit of value. It wasn't going to be based off of speculative markets like what we have now. His death and overthrow, soon followed after he announced plans to do this and try to organize with other countries to implement this financial standard. But going back to FDR, FDR then after detaching us from the gold standard, believe it or not, of our currency, he then made an order to confiscate all of people's gold and then gave them cash in exchange for it. So then to replenish the United States' gold supplies. It was kind of a dick move, but supposedly it was going to get us out of the Depression. And a lot of what FDR, I'm not trying to shit on FDR, but a lot of what FDR did to reboot the economy really didn't do as much as people say that it did. And that's all big misconstrued. Everyone talks about the New Deal, and people even try to piggyback off it. They call it, there's the Green New Deal. And, some people say, I have a economic stimulus bill, and they tout FDR doing the same thing, and it got us out of the Depression. It really didn't. It really didn't. It really didn't. A lot of people contribute how we got out of the Depression. A big contributor of rebounding the economy was getting into World War II in December of 1941. And believe it or not, lots of people are saying that was a main contributor to just decades of American success and economic stability, etc. Because we came out of the war, we wrote the treaties, because after war, there's also restitution that needs to be paid, etc. So we came out of the war really good. And, while lots of people talk about FDR's attempts to reboot the economy, World War II, winning a major war, really just did some amazing things for our economy and really set us up for many decades ahead. But this is what's predicted. To get us out of this inflation crisis we're currently in, the history lesson aside, economists predict that financial institutions will have to change the rules of money for a third time. The first time was removing us from the gold standard back in 1933. The second was when Nixon removed gold to be able to be redeemed. So you couldn't redeem you couldn't take dollars to a bank or what have you to redeem gold. So they Nixon completely detached us from gold in the 70s. And now we're facing another crunch, and most economists are saying, well, why don't we just change the rules of money for a third time and see if we can't make it crash-proof this time. But this third time, I think they're going to completely remove any sort of actual tangible value from money itself. And we're going to break down why, and the documentary touches on it, but we're going to go over it a little more in detail. This change obviously is going to be a blockchain-based currency, much like how Bitcoin is run today. Currently being built is an alternative financial structure, ripe for use if the U.S. economy goes upside down. And, some countries are in a bit of denial about it. Some countries see it as the U.S. trying to gain control over the world economy by trying to introduce this kind of blockchain, based digital currency. And some of these countries have banned Bitcoin altogether, like Algeria, Bangladesh, China, Egypt, Iraq, Morocco, Nepal, Qatar, Tunisia, and especially China. And why doesn't China particularly like Bitcoin? They don't like Bitcoin for a different reason. China doesn't like Bitcoin because it has no control over it. It can freeze a dissonance bank account with Chinese yuan in it, but it can't freeze their Bitcoin wallets. And that's one of the main reasons why it's banned. By the way, China's yuan is 16 cents to the US dollar. So although Bitcoin has some countries scared and some people realizing that it's an alternative financial structure being built in case ours crashes, there has been people before we are in the current situation when Bitcoin was still a baby who were some of its main cheerleaders. I want to say some of the people that were responsible for keeping the dream alive. Back when a Bitcoin was worth cents, a couple of dollars. John McAfee was one of Bitcoin's first cheerleaders. Many people know of McAfee as from his antivirus software that he made, that he then sold to another company and retired. And then he was kind of seen as this rebel billionaire on the loose. He was being prosecuted in many countries for tax evasion, which he vehemently denied. And while he was denying this and going from and running around in his yacht, trying to keep one step ahead of whatever country was trying to bleed him dry, he was regularly attending Bitcoin conferences back in the early days to promote the currency. And I don't think a lot of people realize, McAfee was really one of the first celebrities besides Satoshi, who was really one of the first celebrities of the currency. There's, unfortunately, his death ended while he was in a Spanish prison. Rest in peace, John McAfee. His suicide note is expected to be a forgery. He even got a tattoo in November of 2019, and even tweeted it out. And it has, on the side of his arm, it says, it's the Cash App symbol with the word whacked. And it was a tattoo on his arm. The tattoo actually, his accompanying message was, with the picture of the tattoo, was getting subtle messages from U.S. officials saying, in effect, "We're coming for you, McAfee. We're going to kill yourself. I got a tattoo just in case. If I suicide myself, I didn't. I was whacked," which is what his tattoo said with his Cash App symbol. "Check my right arm." Then our movie goes into the Winklevoss twins, which are the co-creators of Facebook, assume that a Fed coin, or federal blockchain model, will soon be built to coalesce alongside the current cash system in case of a financial crash as well. The central banks are already developing what they're calling central bank digital currencies, which is essentially a non-decentralized currency but protected by the quantum blockchain. So they realize if all money is digital, it can make crashes obsolete. And that means money doesn't have to be backed by anything other than, a computer system, essentially. It's all about speculative value. And that sounds silly, right? How are banks just going to start their own currency? All these central banks are going to just start their own currency based off of nothing. Well, that's essentially Bitcoin. Bitcoin is all based off this hype model, essentially, which is why it's volatile. So if you want to at least plot the role of banks are essentially developing what they are calling the digital central bank currency, right? So banks have essentially gone from hoarders of gold to selling an idea of value that most people, let me rephrase that. Banks will have essentially gone from hoarders of gold to selling you an idea of value that doesn't even exist in the real world altogether. Money is really about to change. And once this change happens, I think it will be the standard for the next 100 years, 500 years, unless quantum computing becomes commonplace so it can crack the encryption. So, I don't know, let's call it 100 years then. And their only investment in the is going to be the initial technology, logistics, and stabilization of the idea of money. Because think about this, Bitcoin is an idea of value. It's not even tangible. Whereas at least dollars are tangible, and we can look at a dollar and be like, a dollar will buy a dollar's worth. Like I mentioned, like the Arizona team, I know that dollar. I can physically see the dollar, and I've known since I've exchanged a dollar for a series of things, what things are worth, whatever. Which is why when you go to like a swap meet or a flea market, and someone says, "Oh, it's going to be this much," or what have you, we have that initial idea because the money is there in 3D. You know what I'm saying? So everyone's idea of money is still a tangible idea, which helps reinforce the value of exchange. I don't know why the human brain works that way, but it just does. But essentially, they're going to be going from hoarding gold to giving us essentially like an IOU for something that they promise is somewhere, to now just money is just going to be a fucking idea. And it will make reporting the money supply becoming a non-issue, since it will control the ones and zeros that even make their system even work. And the wealthy elite, the 1%, are going to be the only people who can actually afford that quantum technology, because supposedly there are some people talking about quantum technology can be cracked. But I'm not sure about that. I don't think they're that commonplace yet. And if anything, who knows, they might impose laws against only quantum computers, or you might need a special license or something, who knows. But, it's going to make, essentially, banks are now just going to be selling an idea and then convincing us to trade that idea for physical assets like gold, which then they will just hold on to. So bank's next role, or at least money's next role in the world, is going to be an idea and trying to get you to give up your shit for an idea. Because it's bank just essentially just money is just going to be what's on a server. But I think banks are going to do essentially what companies do. Banks are essentially going to let banks are essentially going to do what most large companies do when a new sort of industry pops up, like vaping or what have you, and then companies will sit there and let all the little guys. Well, I don't want to give it away, but how usually a company, or usually industry juggernauts will swallow something that is coming up. They're essentially going to project that onto Bitcoin, and how it's going to work is banks are essentially going to let Bitcoin do most of the heavy lifting, make all the mistakes, and so when it finally gets burned down, when let's say Bitcoin finally falls in value, when they see it as no longer useful, they'll look to replace it with their system that will be faster to transact, more stable, and be more convenient over time. Even Ray Dalio predicts that when the change to the digital dollar system happens, the change will happen very fast. And I'm thinking over, 2 to 4 years, once that change over to the digital dollar happens, or the digital financial system, 100% financial system happens, it will be very fast. Within a couple of years, they'll expect everyone to transition. And if that's the prediction Ray Dalio gives out. And if you don't know who Ray Dalio is, in the movie, Ray Dalio is one of the world's most brilliant financial minds of our time. The kind of the background of Ray Dalio, believe it or not, when he was in high school, he was a C student almost all the way through high school. And then he went to a small regional college, and while he was in college, he began trading stocks. But he wasn't very happy with the returns, so he soon got into the commodities market, and he found out that commodities was his gig. He was really good at it. I mean, a whiz, in fact. And if you don't know what commodities are like basic essential needs, like grain, milk, like things that people need, the base level ingredients for most of our products. But he was really good at it, and he excelled at trading commodities so well that he was eventually accepted into Harvard. And one summer when he was at college in Harvard, he took up a entry-level summer job at the stock exchange, where he was working around the time Nixon took the country off the gold standard. And that meant people could no longer exchange US dollars for gold bullion and reduce our gold supply. And nearly the next day, stocks jumped to 33%, up to 33% the next day, when Nixon was in office. He then went back after, I believe he made some money in the stock market when that happened. And then when he went back to school, he started a company called Bridgewater with some of his college buddies. And that didn't go as planned, but he retained the name and then started Bridgewater himself under the same name because it was personal to him. And then that became his baby, and that's what Ray Dalio is known for. He maintains one of the most successful commodity trading hedge funds in the world currently. And he may be the 1%, but he definitely is a example of starting from the bottom and then using his skill and fortuitiveness to build his fortune. He's not old money. He worked for it. So, he's still anchored in what it means to be, a normie. And so when he looks at the financial markets, etc., he also takes into consideration how it affects working class people, etc. So when Ray Dalio speaks, people listen. Just kind of going off on the side, if Ray Dalio also has a series on YouTube about finances that's worth watching. Even showing like your kids or something, so they learned about money and what to expect from the world. And they get to learn it from a world expert in money and value and finances. But he essentially gives what most people don't have a very good grasp of. He gives these lessons away for free. They're beautifully animated. He makes it super simple, and he explains it really well. And I definitely check it out. Check out Ray Dalio's series on money and value and finances. It's free and it's on YouTube. But essentially, though, when Ray speaks about financial products like Bitcoin, people listen, and I think he's right. I think hitting the nail on the head. When that change happens, it's gonna be quick. I think a few years, everyone's gonna have to figure out a digital wallet, etc. I mean, even my mom uses a smartphone now to watch, pirated movies, for fuck's sake. So I mean, I think even the boomers are gonna have a basic understanding of what's gonna go on when that happens. So I don't think that they're too worried about it. Everyone already has all their cell phone with them all the time. Even, even my mother, who is a boomer, has her cell phone with her all the time. So I don't feel like it's going to be crazy, but it definitely will be fast. But essentially the Fed will let crypto, these new crypto markets make all the mistakes. So all these crazy coins you're seeing now, look at that as like the beta test. So the Fed and all these large central banks are going to let all these smaller currencies, upstart currencies, etc., make all the mistakes. And they're going to sit there and they're going to observe and they're going to learn how far they can push things, how scams are going to work in this new digital economy, how the internet affects value, volatility, how to control volatility, how to speed up adoption, network protocol speeds, best usage models for different kinds of transactions, and the optimal crypto exchange model. And then they're going to buy out all the leaders, tech patents, and influence logistics, and let products like Bitcoin and Ethereum make all the mistakes, as well as like Shibu coin and Buttcoin and all these other financial products. They're all test cases, and the big guys are just sitting there letting all these things happen because it's like the wild west. But since things happen so fast on the internet, and they're just going to track it, they're just going to watch it. They're going to let products like Bitcoin and Ethereum make all the mistakes, and they're going to use their coffers to buy up the market. When they're ready to make their move, they're going to use their coffers of all the money they have to buy up the market. They're going to sabotage competitors. They're going to develop market influence committees under the guise of stability watchdogging, but really to put themselves in the same position that they're in now, control. And I believe lots of poverty and struggle could even possibly happen in the short time between now and 2030 in order to facilitate these ambitions. All things considered, though, what will happen is a major change in how money is going to work at least by the end of this decade, by 2030. However it happens, what the catalyst is going to be, I think that is up for debate. But a projected deficit of twice our GDP by the next 4 years is something really hard to wrap your head around. And it almost feels like we might have to go into another war or have to change the financial system altogether with, the new digital currency model altogether in order to fix things. I just don't see how we're going to get our way out of this. And we could do it through hard work, and it could take until the end of the decade to fix it. Or we can just change the rule of money or get into a fucking war. I'm not sure. I haven't really read the tea leaves to see where things are going. Usually this documentary series is made towards the end of each year that I make this documentary on, because it's like I can't really see too far in the future because I have all the same tools that you do. I watch the news, but I'm like drinking from the fire hose. I follow a million people. I pay attention to things people say. I just save clips constantly. I don't even know why I'm saving, if it'll be useful or not. I have like 1,000 videos that I have in these playlists I don't even use. It's just like something interesting happens, and because I don't know if that will be the catalyst for something later, considering how the media likes to hide stories, I just got to hold on to these things now. And I can't tell you what's saying what's going to happen in the next film in the series or 2030, but what I can do is be vigilant and pay attention to things and research things and back them by legitimate sources, not bullshit, and then create this product for you, this documentary, where in 2 hours you can kind of be prepared and better educate yourself, while one percenters keep us distracted and have us not really too concerned about what's going on. We're just angrily debating each other about bullshit that doesn't mean anything, whereas the things that do mean something we're kept in the dark about. So I'm hoping this documentary series has however long I can keep making it, however long I'm still on this planet. I want to keep doing that for you. And I think the next podcast in this companion series is going to go into some other things that are looking towards the future more, but I can only create and keep creating the series as far out as I can keep seeing. And I feel like, that's not very far out. But essentially, whatever is going on, at least in the financial market, is unsustainable. So what I recommend you do is to stack sats, as I say. Just keep stacking Bitcoin. You don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin. You can buy pieces of Bitcoin. My most recommended option for you is, if you have a regular job or a side hustle and you have some guaranteed income, is your best bet moving forward is to split your savings in half. So let's say you put 20% of your paycheck every month into savings, put 10% of that into crypto, and only stick with the key players. Ethereum, Bitcoin Cash are the real stable, well, not so much stable, but have a high perceived value, where you could at least see a consistent return on your investment, as well as feel safe if the market just goes to shit. If the actual financial market goes to shit, so you have this pool of money to protect yourself. And I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I don't think it's going to the crash is going to happen this year, but definitely by 2026. Where we're supposed to have a double the amount, a double our GDP in national debt, $52 trillion. It would be more close to that nightmare scenario. And at least if you're stacking sats now, or you're at least literally buying gold bullion, which is another option, you know what I'm saying? Because gold is never going to change. Bitcoin is essentially digital gold. But I definitely recommend you start splitting your assets up. And this is more like rainy day fund shit. Some people might see this as an investment. I see this as covering your ass when this happens. Or the upside to this is, let's say there isn't a crash, but there's a smooth transition of the market. Oh my God, would that be fucking awesome? A smooth transition of the market where we transition over to the digital financial economy completely, and you already got all this money parked there, and because there's mass adoption and everyone has to buy into it, all of a sudden your value of all your shit just skyrockets. So you're either planning for the future, or it's fucking insurance if the shit crashes. But essentially, Bitcoin is Bitcoin and digital currencies is the future. Hopefully Bitcoin doesn't get eclipsed and sabotaged by the banks, because they're not going to give up their control. They're not. They're just going to find a way to weasel in. But hopefully you can at least protect yourself and really see products like Bitcoin and digital currency as a sound investment. And I definitely recommend, if anything, you go and get the Cash App. Because with the Cash App, you can just... See, here's the thing with buying Bitcoin. Some of these platforms, there's drama involved. I got to give you my ID. And then once I give you my ID, then they have to it's like setting up a PayPal account for a business. Then they have to deposit some money into your account, and then you got to check the thing. And not all banks are supported by all these crypto marketplaces, but Cash App, bro, Cash App, get the fucking Cash App. Literally, you get a Cash App, you get a fucking Cash App card. It is so easy to get it. It's not like a credit card. It's basically like a reloadable debit card or whatever. And that's what you should just use to pay for your normal shit, and then just have your bank for your savings and paying your bills. But your Cash App is for tangible things you need to spend money on, like gasoline and groceries and taking your old lady out to get a steak. But they make it super easy. It is the least drama way to buy Bitcoin right now. And if you really can think about your future and you're really thinking about stacking sats is essentially like, think of a Bitcoin as a dollar. One Bitcoin is like saying $1. Sat is like cents. So a sat, because it's based off the name of Satoshi Nakamoto, who created Bitcoin. Sats is essentially like saying cents. So if you're not well versed, I wasn't well versed. I know I might sound like an idiot explaining to somebody who understands, but not everybody is up to speed who watches my documentary series. But stack sats. Start buying just little pieces of a Bitcoin through your Cash App, but split up your monthly savings, your 20%. Just put 10% in the bank, and then put 10% into the crypto. Don't buy into anything other than, the best things I can recommend is Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, and Ethereum. Those are the safest places in crypto to go ahead and put your money into things. But start with a Cash App. It is so damn easy to buy Bitcoin with that. It's incredible. And just start protecting your financial future, whether it's for insurance or the fact that once mass adoption happens, it's going to fucking skyrocket. Thanks for listening to the 2030 Vision podcast. You can watch the full movie at 2030vision.movie. You can check out our news project, the Mesh News Project, at meshnews.org. That's MESH news.org. And you obviously can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and all those other platforms and megaphones with links on our website. And thanks for listening.